Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an intriguing study guide that explores a profoundly transformative concept: how loving Jesus fundamentally alters a person's everyday conduct. We're going to unpack the source material's perspective on the sheer power of this love and how it translates into very specific principles for Christian living. We'll be looking at answers the text provides regarding our conduct, entertainment, how we dress, and how we ultimately influence others. It's a fascinating framework, so let's get right into it.
The source material actually opens with a really memorable anecdote that sets the stage perfectly. It describes a university student who was assigned this massive, incredibly dry book for a literature course. She could barely keep her eyes open to read it. But then, she met a young professor, fell in love, and discovered that he was the author of that very book. Suddenly, she devoured the whole thing in a single night, calling it an absolute masterpiece. The text uses this story to brilliantly illustrate a core premise. Scripture and religious rules often feel super boring or even oppressive until you actually fall in love with the Creator. Once that relationship is there, your whole perspective completely shifts.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to unpack 5 specific areas today. First, a love that transforms. Second, media and entertainment guidelines. Third, the power of influence. Fourth, modesty and appearance. And finally, the joy of obedience.
Starting off with Section 1, a love that transforms. The source frames this as being remarkably similar to a happy marriage.
To really grasp the lifestyle changes this text advocates, we have to look at the underlying motivation. The source frames the ideal Christian life not as this cold, strict legalism just to avoid punishment, but as a joyful relationship. Think about a happy marriage. You naturally want to do what pleases your spouse, right? You view principles not as demanding restrictions, but as real opportunities to bring them joy. The study guide argues that true believers naturally want to do what pleases Jesus, finding their joy in that devoted partnership. And this verse, 1 John 4:19, is highlighted as the foundational motivation for literally all the Christian living principles outlined in the guide. The argument is that Jesus' unfailing love and his willingness to die for humanity is the catalyst. It's the spark for everything. Everything else we're about to discuss regarding behavior and lifestyle is positioned as a direct, natural response to this initial love from God.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the text breaks down worldly temptations. It neutrally categorizes all sin into 3 biblical danger zones. You have the lust of the flesh, which refers to physical temptations, the lust of the eyes, which are visual enticements, and the pride of life, centering on ego and vanity. According to the text, when individuals love these worldly things, they are essentially aligning themselves against God.
Moving right along to Section 2, Media and Entertainment Guidelines. This is all about guarding our senses.
Shifting from the theoretical to the highly practical, the study guide gets very specific about guarding what we consume. It presents a clear theological argument regarding Satan's tactics. And notably, the source doesn't depict the devil as some mythical beast with horns and claws, but rather as a deceitful, wicked-faced being in a priestly tunic. The core message here is that negative influences are carefully, intentionally crafted to bypass our defenses through what we see and hear every single day. To support this, the text actually cites researchers who have observed the profound physical and psychological power of secular music. It notes that certain music enters the brain entirely through the emotions, completely bypassing our logical reasoning. Not only that, it literally affects bodily functions, altering pulse and breathing rates without the listener even realizing it's happening. And finally, it points out that syncopated rhythms can create a type of hypnosis or altered mood. To really drive this point home, the lesson quotes secular rock stars themselves to prove that certain music debases feelings and desires. It references Rolling Stone frontman Mick Jagger describing the sexual adrenaline of the music, and features this striking quote from John Oates of Hall & Oates, stating flat out that rock and roll is 99% sex. The study guide uses these direct admissions to ask a pretty pointed question: would music with this as its primary focus truly please Jesus?
And this critique absolutely extends to television and film too. The source argues that TV is rapidly turning the world into a cesspool of immorality. To quantify this, it highlights a really surprising 1995 Newsweek statistic. According to that study, if television were somehow eliminated, there would be 10,000 fewer murders, 70,000 fewer rapes, and a staggering 700,000 fewer assaults per year in the United States alone. To put that into perspective, the text uses this data to emphasize the very real-world behavioral impact of visual entertainment.
So,
How does the guide suggest navigating all of this? Well, it offers a highly practical litmus test for all our entertainment choices. It poses this rhetorical question. If Jesus came to visit you in person today, what music or TV shows would you actually feel comfortable asking him to sit down and enjoy with you? According to the source, any media you wouldn't feel comfortable sharing with him is something you should probably walk away from.
Which brings us to Section 3, the power of influence, and how our personal choices inevitably impact those around us.
Now, as the text expands from personal purity to our impact on others, a very natural reaction to these strict guidelines comes up. The text actually poses the common pushback question itself. But can I just use my best judgment? It's a fair point, right? Why rely on such rigid external rules if we feel like we're making good, balanced choices in our own minds? Well, the crucial point here is that the text firmly argues against relying on our own easily misguided feelings or human judgment. Quoting Proverbs, the guide points out that what seems perfectly right and logical to us as humans can actually lead straight to destruction. The source maintains that human feelings are just too easily manipulated, so true Christian behavior shouldn't be decided by feelings or majority rule, but strictly by the parameters set out in Scripture.
Next up is Section 4, Modesty and Appearance, applying these principles to how we present ourselves. The study guide applies these exact same biblical principles directly to dress and adornment. It states that immodest dress ties right back into the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. To explain its specific stance on removing ornaments and jewelry, the guide provides a few biblical examples. It notes that Jacob's family buried their jewelry when dedicating their lives to God. It points out that Isaiah chapter 3 lists wearing specific ornaments as a sin of pride. And it references Hosea chapter 2, which directly connects the wearing of jewelry with Israel turning away from the Lord.
And this brilliantly illustrates the wider theological contrast the text is making. The guide points to the book of Revelation to show these opposing biblical symbols based on outward adornment. It contrasts the true church, symbolized in Revelation 12 as a pure woman clothed simply with the sun and righteousness, against the apostate church in Revelation 17, which is symbolized as a harlot heavily adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. The text argues that God asks his people to step away from flashy adornments that draw attention to the self in favor of a quiet, humble spirit.
Finally, we reach Section 5, the joy of obedience, the deeper internal motivation for all of this.
So what is the actual driving force behind adopting these pretty conservative lifestyle standards? The guide reiterates that obedience absolutely must be rooted in Scripture, not our emotional whims. To reinforce this, it shares this really powerful anecdote. It reminds the reader that the Jewish leaders in the Bible truly felt they were doing the right thing when they crucified Jesus. Their feelings led them completely astray. The source uses this to argue that the devil can easily manipulate our emotions, meaning we have to depend exclusively on the word to guide our actions.
Now, with all these detailed standards regarding media, dress, and conduct, a very practical question pops up. Should you try to convict or lecture other people about these standards? According to the text, the answer is a resounding no. The guide advises that believers should be primarily concerned with examining their own lifestyle rather than policing everyone else's.
Instead of lecturing, the text emphasizes that a genuinely transformed heart naturally desires to be a silent, shining witness. Looking at Matthew 5, the guide points out a simple truth. You don't hear a light, you see it. It argues that people will see a Christian shine through their everyday conduct, their modesty, their conversation, and their kindness. This silent, steady example is what the source claims will actually provoke curiosity and ultimately draw others toward Christ.
Which brings us to the ultimate question posed by the source material. We've explored the guide's perspective on how true devotion shifts obedience from a heavy burden to an absolute joy, impacting everything from the media we consume to the clothes we wear. It all traces back to that initial motivation, falling in love with the author. So I'll leave you with a final, provocative thought to reflect on. Based on the principles outlined in this text, does your daily lifestyle truly reflect a love that transforms? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning, keep learning.